I have encountered this notion as I was sifting through Amazon reviews for Pavel's new book, Axe. It even popped up in the comments on our YouTube channel, albeit worded a little differently. While I can't say that I disagree with the sentiment, I don't agree either. Yes, the workout protocol can be summed up in a few sentences, or in a short video like the one we posted recently. Explaining the system behind it takes more effort though. And here's where things get a little murky. Grüezi miteinander, Gregory von Lebe hier. Many of our subscribers have asked me to review Pavel's new book, Axe. After reading it twice and conducting thorough research, I've drawn my conclusions, which I want to share in this video. But before we get started, we help busy over 40s get in shape with only 30 minutes of kettlebell training per week in the next 30 days. If you want to find out more about our method, download our free ebook in the first link in the description. Also note that during this review, I'm going to use excerpts from my conversation with Professor Robert Roberts from Queensland University of Technology, who holds a PhD in human bioenergetics and has published more than 130 research manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals. If you're interested in listening to the full podcast, you'll find the link to this episode in the description. It is vital for you, the viewer, to understand my position on Pavel, and by extension, any coach, trainer, or influential figure in the kettlebell space. Pavel Tstatsouline, alongside John Duquesne, can and must be credited for the modern kettlebell renaissance in the West that took place at the turn of the century. Pavel has been so influential that he's bound to seep into any long-format kettlebell conversation among practitioners who have spent their fair share of time with one of the most powerful exercise tools on the planet. Almost every guest I've had on my podcast named one of his books as the sole reason they discovered kettlebells. If it weren't for the hardcore tough guy claiming "you're now on Soviet territory" in his early DVDs, my mentor Steve Carter, who became the foundation of my work in the kettlebell sphere, probably wouldn't have discovered them either. I respect the man for his work, and I pay homage by listening closely anytime he has something to say. Yet, sometimes, people seem to misunderstand respect with blind faith. Aristotle once wrote, "It is the mark of an educated man to entertain a thought without accepting it." Above anything else, my mission is to seek truth, not approval. If there's one thing I can be certain of, it's this: the holy grail of fitness, or training for that matter, doesn't exist. And anybody who dispenses an iteration of it must be carefully scrutinized. It is rather an accumulation of knowledge over the years through collaborative efforts between science and practice that leads us closer to the truth. In the end, many roads lead to Rome, which means that there are different ways to achieve the same result. This is the scientific approach I want to follow. After all, science is not about increasing knowledge to prove a point, but to discover more about our surroundings to reduce the level of uncertainty. Science is not always clear, but gives clarity. And in the absence of empirical data, charlatans rule and gain the upper hand by delivering you an alternative and highly volatile route to paradise. Science isn't perfect though, since it's still authored by the hands of humans. It is, however, one of the most powerful assessment tools available. This credo is the reason I'm questioning anyone or anything, including myself, unless it's my faith in Christ. Which, however, as I've learned on a side note through William Lane Craig's book On Guard, can be defined with logic and reason, and is adeptly called Christian apologetics. But I'm digressing. To get back to my point about questioning training philosophies, strategies, and systems, I follow an even more cautious approach when I encounter statements like this: Axe is flawless, and they lack for nothing. This is the last sentence of his 191-page-long siege against high-intensity interval training and glycolysis. While I do understand the need to speak confidently for several reasons, absolute declarations like these are a red flag to me.
Everyone who tries them swears by them. Everyone. That's how you know it's a fucking lie. Guess the fraction of people that have been satisfied with RP products. There are people out there that hate RP. There are people out there that use our products and got bad results. Why? Because the real world. Now, we've helped a lot of people, but real products don't give you magic results.
Pavel's book is loosely divided into two parts: the science and the system. Before we jump into the science, I want to give a personal opinion about Pavel's captivating writing style. While almost every word he wrote in Simple and Sinister encapsulates some form of wisdom that can be applied and revisited for refreshment often, in Axe, I seem to have missed it. It almost seems that Pavel's hell-bent intent to demonize a beloved training method and one of the most important energy systems of the human body completely wiped out his creativity, although you see it pop up here and there. Yet, there's an interesting twist. While the reading material in Simple and Sinister is packed with great knowledge, the workout protocol doesn't live up to its hype. In X, it's the complete opposite. While the writing, and the science for that matter, leave more questions than answers, the training that precedes it is enjoyable and fun. While a bit too minimalistic, you can still spice it up to suit your needs. But more on that later. From a writing perspective, he also might have held back a little, since he's working on his new book titled Metal Heart. Let's start the discussion about the science behind X with a brief refresher from Professor Roberts about how human beings metabolize energy.
So it's the phosphagen system. So that's what the older textbooks used to call the ATP-PC system, or what you may have heard of as the immediate energy system. Then we have the glycolytic system. So glycolysis is a series of 9 reactions. It exists in skeletal muscle to break down stored glycogen, as well as use glucose taken up from the blood. When exercise gets too intense, though, that need for ATP can't be met by the mitochondria because it's a relatively slow energy production system. A large capacity, but relatively slow. So then we need more and more energy from ATP. The final system then would be mitochondrial respiration. Certainly that uses oxygen, but for most of us, unless you're in Switzerland, I mean, you can go up in altitude and be deficient in oxygen. But for most of us, I'm at sea level, it's a bit different. The issue is really about the rate in which you need the ATP. And when the muscle needs that ATP at a faster rate than the mitochondria can handle, even though there's plenty of oxygen, there's a problem. And that problem is exacerbated if you go to high altitude and you have less oxygen availability.
The talking points behind the X science are pretty straightforward. Glycolysis, which is one of the 3 major cogs in the flywheel of how humans metabolize energy, does dirty deeds in your body and is the harbinger of destruction. So avoid it at all costs with anti-glycolytic training. To avoid glycolysis as much as possible, engage in short, intense bouts of training, rest, and never cross the lactic threshold, where the burn zone awaits. High-intensity interval training is the enemy, and proponents of it are zombies who are only awake when it comes to training and are in and out of the doctor's office for unexplained health reasons. Part of what I just said are literal quotes from the book. If they make you cringe a little bit, you're not the only one. Here's Professor Roberts' reaction. Deep and frequent glycolytic training, the brand so common in fitness training today that leaves you lying on your back, sucking wind in its wake, causes an accumulation of cellular damage that will express itself on a systemic level as daily lethargy, a lack of energy, and eventually adrenal exhaustion shutdown, which begins a cascade of endocrine problems that your doctor will not likely figure out. Research suggests that frequent exposure to the free radicals and lactate produced by continued exercising above the cell's ability to use oxygen, high-intensity anaerobic work, causes cellular organelle damage that accelerates aging and causes ill health. You can see this cluster of symptoms manifest in a typical high-intensity junkie who walks around like a zombie, is only awake when it's time to train, and is in and out of the doc's office for unexplained health issues. Deep glycolytic training is a highly volatile form of rocket fuel that should only be minimally dosed by elite athletes preparing for an event that either grants them $1 million paycheck or an Olympic gold medal.
Wow. Yeah. Nice writing, but I don't see the logic. I mean, certainly we don't want everybody trying to train like an elite athlete. I mean, but to me that's an obvious, but that doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there's tremendous health benefits from more quality exercise. And we know from the last 80 years of epidemiology that the more intense you exercise, the greater the disease prevention and the greater your longevity and the greater your quality of life because you have less disease, so less morbidity. There's that whole epidemiological health benefit argument and the evidence that I just talked about that totally opposes that logic. So, taken to an extreme, we don't train everybody to be right? An elite athlete, but we certainly do need to train them to tolerate more intense exercise, because that gives the overwhelming health benefit to combat hypercholesterolemia and excess body fat, and improving the cardiovascular system, and improving the structure and function of the myocardium of the heart. You know, there's a long debate to have against that quote.
The science part of the book sent me into research mode for one particular reason. A large chunk of the scientific papers he shared were from Viktor Selyanov and Yuri Verkhoshansky. After searching for Selyanov, I found two sources about him as a person. The first source is this article that states Selyanov was a bit of a renegade, and because of disagreements with the science establishment, he never completed his doctorate. Nevertheless, his contribution to the understanding of training endurance was invaluable, and Russian sports science is still bitterly divided between his followers and opponents. The second source was a video from one of his seminars at a strength and conditioning facility. After reaching out, I unfortunately haven't heard anything back as of the recording of this video. Verkhoshansky seems like a more solid figure. I've read several of his works, with great difficulty I might add, and have one of his books partly translated by Dr. Michael Yessis, who I've also been fortunate enough to have a podcast conversation with. Here's what's interesting to me. Verkhoshansky is most notably known for his explosive and plyometric work, which has been adopted by the late great Louis Simmons from Westside Barbell, with great success, as we all know. Pavel clearly states and asks Dr. Yuri's contributions to Strong First anti-glycolytic training, which, as a side note, doesn't seem to exist, but more on this later. While I've never noticed an anti-glycolytic approach in Dr. Yuri Verkhoshansky's book, I might have missed it or it's been lost in translation. My takeaway point that I agree on and take home is the exercise execution. Every rep should look similar, if not the same as the other. Dr. Yuri also states the following about endurance. The best way to develop strength endurance is to execute the competition exercises under difficult conditions or in large volume. This statement seems to be in stark contrast to the anti-glycolytic principles touted in the book. Dr. Yuri seems to be at odds with Waldemar Geschler, a legendary track and field coach from Germany, when defining interval training. Dr. Yuri thought the hallmark of interval training is insufficient rest periods. Waldemar Geschler, who by the way is the godfather of interval training, was always betting on sufficient rest periods in between sets. Then again, German sports scientist Tony Nett seemed to prove Dr. Yuri's assumptions of long format training for long distance runners. Contradictions in science are exactly what move the needle further down towards the truth. In the chapter An Axe to Grind with HIIT, Pavel lists the dangers of acid and how it ruins athletic performance. Quote, "Dumbest cancer, glycolysis, which happens to be cancer's energy pathway of choice, kills itself. The culprit, interval training, commonly dubbed as high-intensity interval training, which happens to be a misnomer of some sorts, since interval training postulates high intensity, a sentiment that also Pavel shares and that I wholeheartedly agree with. Putting this in perspective, however, is a quick Google search that spat out a scientific review of close to 200 studies that, quote, "It has been shown that interval training models can provide similar health and performance benefits despite less time commitment." So I wasn't surprised to spot holes in X's scientific groundings, and even some cases of bro science concerning adrenal shutdown or fatigue. A thorough, critical analysis of the science behind Pavel's new program remains elusive, however. He starts the references and notes chapter with this: most of the Russian language references are not available in English. To the yay folks, this presents a valid point. After all, Pavel holds a secret key to a long-lost library in the Siberian tundra, stacked with secret papers from the Soviet Union. To the nay folks, it's a convenient excuse. On a serious note, is Pavel onto something because of old research that's collected dust, but will revolutionize the fitness and sports industry in its wake? It's a possibility, though highly unlikely. To end my review on the scientific chapter, I want to share an analogy from Dr. Lane Norton he dubbed method versus outcome.
People think when they hear a mechanism, when you hear a biochemical pathway, they think automatically outcome. Insulin inhibits lipolysis in fat cells and increases lipogenesis. Therefore, if you're eating a high carb diet, it is going to make you fat regardless of calories. That, what we're talking about, insulin's effects on lipolysis and lipogenesis, those are mechanisms. An outcome would be if we feed people diets that produce different levels of insulin with different amounts of carbohydrates, but we hold calories equal do we see differences in the actual loss of body fat? So an outcome is when you're measuring the thing that you're actually concerned about in humans. So what do we care more about? Do you care more about this mechanism of insulin having this effect on lipolysis in the short term? Or do you care about, do these subjects lose more body fat? I care about the loss of body fat. If we look at outcomes, outcome is like a mutual fund, which a mutual fund is made up of a bunch of funds, a bunch of stocks. Somebody focusing on a mechanism would be like somebody looking at an individual stock in a mutual fund of 500 stocks and saying, ooh, you don't want to invest in this mutual fund. Look at this stock in this mutual fund. It's down by 40% this year, while neglecting to tell you that the overall mutual fund is up by 30%. Do you care about the individual stock that's down, or do you care about the mutual fund that's crushing it? You care about the mutual fund because that is the outcome.
Anaerobic exercise produces more free radicals in the short term, so that's the method. But the outcome, the big picture, is better health, as stated by an updated stance on current scientific evidence on free radicals.
I mean, to be honest, right, my career now, which is, let me see, would be almost 40 years, right, in research and physiology, I've never heard of a negative interpretation of the function of glycolysis other than the now outdated view that it causes acidosis, which it can contribute to, but we have to remember that there are many potentially negative side effects to a pathway that might end up being the stimulus for adaptation. And the best example I can give for that is the cells or muscles production of free radicals, which 25 years ago, there was just a big movement out to try and minimize free radicals because they can cause damage and therefore harm muscle. But then research was done to show, well, that free radical response was really important for muscle to actually adapt to the exercise stress so it can improve.
Let's turn our attention to the system of X, which I thoroughly enjoyed as a training method. After all, I don't care how much academic prowess you bring to the table. If you're going to review a training method, you might as well do it too. You can choose between one of the 4 ballistic pulls: hand-to-hand swing, double hand swing, snatch, or single hand swing. You opt for 20 to 40 sets of the every minute on the minute protocol. This means you do your chosen exercise at the start of each minute and rest until the next minute begins. As a funny side note, you're not supposed to use the CrossFit term of the every minute on the minute protocol as EMOM, but OTM, because if you do, you seem to give credit to the ultimate nemesis. Aim for 4 to 6 high quality reps per exercise and be as explosive and fast as possible. When you rest, do it actively, either with shadow boxing, walking, shaking it off, or controlled and slow 1-pump burpees. While not recommended in the book, I used shaking it off in conjunction with 1-pump burpees as active rest. Include the latter only if you have the engine to deal with it. The goal is to keep the burn minimal and explosiveness high. The premise of the system is based on the rather questionable science dubbed anti-glycolytic training. Based on axis logic, you don't want to turn on the glycolytic system, so therefore you train for 6 to 12 seconds and then rest. This is to harness the power of the creatine phosphate and aerobic system. The attentive viewer now understands the meaning of most of the B-roll in this video. It's the axe workout in the follow-along format. It's also linked in the description if you're curious to see it in action. Here's what Dr. Roberts has to say about the axe training protocol.
The bottom line is they're saying, hey, if we train like this, 10 seconds on, 50 seconds off, or active rest, we avoid glycolysis, therefore it's anti-glycolytic training, and that's the best way to train power and strength, for example. What would be your response to this?
Well, it doesn't avoid glycolysis. As soon as you go into your second contraction, you've already stimulated glycolysis. It may not be training glycolysis as much as standard training, but you're not using glycolysis. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to go for 10 seconds. I mean, my only answer is to expand on the myocardial disease. When we train myocardial disease individuals, we have them go for about 2 or 3 contractions, and then they have to rest for about 4 minutes. Right? And so we have to go down to the extreme that is maybe a quarter of what this approach is advocating. Because of their inability to use glycolysis. So that's again why I say that, well, glycolysis is being operative even in that training.
I enjoyed the workout and plan on incorporating it regularly. However, since I consider the empirical evidence of X rather questionable, I failed to see its unique value proposed by the author. Nevertheless, I realized an important aspect of high-speed work. More muscles have to work, leaving no stone unturned. For full body adaptations and stimulus, we chose the snatch over the swing. According to the Kettlebell Swing Snatch paper by Stuart McGill, the snatch appears to increase the activation of almost all muscles, probably because of the greater effort needed to propel the kettlebell up into the top fixation. In a minimalistic program, I want to get the most bang for my buck. Now, I definitely see the value of Pavel's approach. As discussed in Joe Rogan's podcast, Strong First and their ilk are the antidote to the no pain no gain mantra of bodybuilding and the rhabdo mentality of CrossFit, and rightfully so. If you continuously destroy yourself in your training sessions, you might suffer consequences down the line. On the other hand, we shouldn't be scared of the red zone. Pavel even states in his book that those who are easily shocked should be shocked more often. A trainer with common sense should understand that the average population doesn't need the same training stimulus like high-level athletes do. While this doesn't mean that we cannot adapt certain training philosophies like interval training, for example, from elite sports performers to sedentary people or even patients, we must understand that training is supposed to stress your body for positive adaptations. When adapting these systems though, as a trainer, you have to first do no harm. So it makes sense to include and train all of the body's energy systems. In a way, how I like to call the hunter-gatherer method. You run, jump, walk, pull, push, move, explode, go on long hikes, go fast, go slow, lift heavy, push light, and use everything at your disposal. Leaving anything away that's intended to be used is like playing God. Here's how Dr. Roberts addresses it.
When we get systemically acidic, our nervous system doesn't like it. But when it comes to skeletal muscle, more and more research is showing that it's not as encumbered as we once thought, 20, 30 years ago. So, we have to be careful there in how we don't overinterpret too many things. So systemic acidosis is bad. As I mentioned, I'm off to Europe to talk about my acidosis work.
Yes.
Disease, right? In disease, acidosis can really make your final prognosis. If you're a patient, you will die, and associated with increased risk of premature death in numerous diseases. But when you're talking about a healthy adult, it's just our nervous system that we have trouble with, and we perceive more fatigue and exhaustion. We're uncomfortable, we're nauseous, we're lightheaded when we get severely acidic. So certainly it's not great for the entire whole body, but when it comes to muscle, right, it's different. There seems to be less concern about muscle function. So, glycolysis, again, I would argue that that's a pathway that's kept us alive and evolving, and that's why we're still here.
Can you completely exclude it if you train it in a specific way?
Almost impossible. I'm doing research right now with one of my PhD students, and his sister has McArdle disease. McArdle disease is a genetic condition where you lack the enzyme phosphorylase. You can't break down muscle glycogen, so you can't fuel glycolysis. And individuals with McArdle disease, but the majority, their maximal power output on a bicycle might be 60 watts. And you're comparing that to an able-bodied athlete that could do 600, 700, 800, 1,800 watts, right? These individuals are so compromised in their ability to tolerate exercise, it's not funny, and an entirely compromised state. So to essentially turn off glycolysis by about 90%, and where only blood glucose can fuel it, means that you a largely sedentary individual.
In conclusion, let me address a couple of concepts outlined in the book in a rapid-fire manner. Read the book to grasp the full meaning of my closing comments. The progression: train twice a week and add a third day if you recover rapidly. Aim for 30 sets with a given weight and progress with reps first before using heavier weight. A great recommendation I would dish out as well: no to intervals and yes to repeats. This is semantics and only adds to the confusion. Solid interval training includes proper rest periods periods, according to Waldemar Gerschler. X What the Hell Effect. X supposedly covers power, speed, hypertrophy, cardio, and fat loss. While fat loss requires being in an energy deficit, all the other qualities of human performance can rather be attributed to the kettlebell than to a particular program. The stop signs. I don't take the list of stop signs when training seriously. They even sound like a joke to me. While technique is important, injury happens if load exceeds capacity. That's the most important aspect you need to be aware of when training. The art of appreciating one thing. Pavel shortly addresses the fact that a minimalistic program might be boring and puts the blame on you for not being focused enough. This made me chuckle a bit. Typical Pavel stuff that resembles some form of a Soviet character from back in the day. While it is definitely true that focusing on the basics work, we also have to again see the difference between athletes and the normal population. Most of us trainers have to work with the latter, not the former. And motivating a sedentary person to become active requires some good kind of variation. Pavel also opened up a bit, which I appreciated. In the book he says to listen to your body if the weight recommendations seem too intimidating. Kudos to the legend for becoming a bit more soft and loving.
Here's the next thing that you have to do. Clean and press that like and subscribe button. Share with a friend who's also interested in kettlebells. And if you made it this far, go buy Pavel's book, X. It's an interesting read, nonetheless, independent of what I have to say. Please make up your own mind. And hey, if you're over 40 and you want to get in shape with kettlebells, check out our free ebook in the first link in the description.